Hello, everybody. I'm Dr. Brad Musil, and this is a reading of The Utility of Religion, Mill, Nietzsche, and James. This will be part 3 of chapter 2, Friedrich Nietzsche and the Antichrist. Again, this is part 3, Religion and Truth. A sincere concern for the truth is something that is of utmost importance to Nietzsche, and aside from health, he seems to value it above all else. Echoing this sentiment, Walter Kaufmann, one of the leading Nietzsche scholars and translators, remarks that quote, Nietzsche himself was a fanatical seeker after truth and recognized no virtue above intellectual integrity. End quote. Footnote 250 cites the source. Indeed, the impact of Nietzsche's high regard for honesty regarding the nature of reality is far-reaching in the development of his philosophy that underlies many of his criticisms of religion. Ultimately, Nietzsche praises masters because they have the courage to be honest and embrace the truth about reality, which essentially amounts to endorsing his thoroughgoing naturalism, and conversely is extremely critical of slaves because they are too weak to accept life as it actually is, i.e., as a constant struggle for power amidst an ever-changing and chaotic existence, and must indulge in self-deception as a result. Nietzsche frequently juxtaposes the honesty of free spirits and masters with the dishonesty of priests, philosophers, and other slaves, and he is not shy about his disdain for the latter, who he thinks deceive themselves about the reality of their lives on earth. Not surprisingly then, in Ecce Homo, Nietzsche laments that, quote, it is precisely the truth that has been absolutely forbidden so far, end quote. Footnote 251 cites the source. And in Beyond Good and Evil, he suggests that, quote, perhaps nobody yet has been truthful enough about what truthfulness is, end quote. Footnote 252 cites the source. Similarly, when remarking on the falsifications and self-deceptions plaguing the history of Christianity, which will be discussed in more detail shortly, Nietzsche writes, quote, we alone, we spirits who have become free, have the requisite presuppositions for understanding what 19 centuries have misunderstood, the honesty that has become instinct and passion that wages war on the holy lie above all other lies, end quote. Footnote 253 cites the source. As opposed to the religious, Nietzsche suggests that free spirits like himself, quote, have become more modest in every way. We have stopped driving humanity from spirit, from divinity. We have stuck human beings back among the animals. End quote. Footnote 254 cites the source. On Nietzsche's account, moving beyond a thoroughgoing naturalism, as slaves do, entails self-deception. This is something most individuals are guilty of doing, as he indicates when reflecting on common misconceptions regarding the Gospels and the origin of Christianity and the Antichrist. Quote, the whole of humanity, even the best minds of the best ages, with a single exception, someone who is perhaps just inhuman, have allowed themselves to be deceived, end quote. Footnote 255 cites the source. In the final section of the Antichrist, he concludes that, quote, a will to lie at any cost, a disgust, a hatred of all good and honest instincts. Those would be the blessings of Christianity as far as I'm concerned. End quote. Footnote 256 cites the source. The self-deception and dishonesty he associates with religion is exacerbated by other instantiations of the slave mentality, such as traditional philosophy. Certainly Nietzsche is quite scathing in his reflections on philosophy. Consider, for example, his synopsis of the history of philosophy. Quote, I will make an exception for a couple of the skeptics, the decent types in the history of philosophy, but the rest of them have no conception of the basic demands of intellectual integrity. End quote. Footnote 257 cites the source. What's more, Nietzsche suggests that modern German philosophy ultimately amounts to, quote, an underhanded theology, end quote. Footnote 258 cites the source, and adds that, quote, philosophers supported the church, the lie of the moral world order, runs through the entire development of philosophy, even modern philosophy, end quote. Footnote 259 cites the source. Ultimately, religion, along with its more salient extensions, such as morality and philosophy, is problematic for Nietzsche insofar as he thinks it fosters self-deception. And in this part of the chapter, I outline the arguments he offers in support of this thesis. As James points out, religion is associated with belief in an unseen order. Quote, were one asked to characterize the life of religion in the broadest and most general terms possible, end quote, James says, quote, one might say that it consists of the belief that there is an unseen order, that our supreme good lies in harmoniously adjusting ourselves thereto, end quote. Footnote 260 cites the source. This kind of belief in the unseen and the supernatural is completely at odds with Nietzsche's naturalism, and he often reflects on the extensive self-deception and falsification of reality he associates with it. And he goes to great lengths in the Antichrist to demonstrate the many ways in which he thinks religions, and usually Christianity in particular, falsify reality as a result of their supernatural emphases. He chronicles, for example, several intangible fictions he associates with Christianity, such as spirit, grace, sin, and souls. Footnote 261 cites the source, and he goes so far as to say that, quote, this entirely fictitious world can be distinguished from the world of dreams to the detriment of the former, and that dreams reflect reality, while Christianity falsifies, devalues, and negates reality, end quote. Footnote 262 cites the source. James, who expresses an appreciation of religion's ability to assuage our existential anxieties through such supernatural beliefs, as I will say much more about in chapter 3, acknowledges Nietzsche's point about the unrealistic nature of at least some religious belief, but he suggests that entertaining unrealistic beliefs is something we all do naturally anyway. Quote, the systemic cultivation of healthy-mindedness as a religious attitude is therefore consonant with important currents in human nature, and is anything but absurd. In fact, we all do cultivate it more or less. We divert our attention from disease and death as much as we can, so that the world we recognize officially in literature and in society is a poetic fiction, far handsomer and cleaner and better than the world that really is. End quote. Footnote 263 cites the source. This seems reminiscent of Nietzsche's depiction of the slave mentality, which he says emphasizes comfort and introduces illusions in order to minimize feelings of pain and danger. What's more, with respect to those he calls slaves, it seems that Nietzsche would have to agree with James's suggestion that this process of falsifying reality is a natural process, since Nietzsche believes that, quote, suffering people need to be sustained by a hope that cannot be refuted by any reality, end quote. Footnote 264 cites the source. I will say more about the ramifications of this being a natural process for the majority of people in parts 5 and 6. Consider also one of the central tenets of many religious and traditional moral viewpoints, the notion of equality. Such views suggest that people be treated equally. For instance, as Nietzsche is quick to point out, the gospel suggests that a fundamental belief of Jesus was that, quote, everyone is equal to everyone else, end quote. Footnote 265 cites the source. In Nietzsche's view, however, this is an unnatural concept, which for Nietzsche makes it a deception, insofar as it is starkly at odds with his naturalism and his reductionist ontology, and his notion that in reality, life is full of inequality. According to Nietzsche, those who are honest with themselves will admit that inequality is an unavoidable fact of life. He asserts that, quote, caste order of rank, is just the formula for the supreme law of life itself. Unequal rights are the condition for any rights at all. A right is a privilege, end quote. Footnote 266 cites the source. Subsequently, quote, injustice is never a matter of unequal rights, it is a matter of claiming equal rights, end quote. Footnote 267 cites the source. In his view, moral theorists, Jesus, and other slaves do not adequately recognize or appreciate this. For this reason, when reflecting on those who he thinks unjustifiably think of Jesus as a kind of genius and a hero, Nietzsche suggests that quote, the rigorous language of physiology would use a different word here, the word idiot, end quote. Footnote 268 cites the source. Footnote 269. Nietzsche goes on to say that, quote, if anything is unevangelical, oh my goodness, it is the concept of a hero, as, quote, the polar opposite of struggle, any feeling of doing battle has become instinct here. An incapacity for resistance has become morality here, end quote. Throughout the Antichrist, Nietzsche describes Christ as being consumed by inward concern and reflection, to the point that he seems not to acknowledge, let alone resist, external reality at all. He claims that Jesus demonstrated, quote, an instinct of hatred for every reality, as a flight into the unimaginable, into the inconceivable, as an aversion to every formula, to every concept of space and time, to everything solid, to every custom, institution, church, as a being at home in a world that has broken off contact with every type of reality, a world that has become completely internal, a true world, an eternal world, end quote. And I cite the source. So that, again, was footnote 269. According to Nietzsche, appeals to religious faith also entail deception. In his view, quote, faith means not wanting to know the truth, end quote. Footnote 270 cites the source. And those expressing it are, therefore, thought to lack a sincere concern for discovering the true nature of reality. Further, Nietzsche claims that, quote, Christianity knows that it is a matter of complete indifference whether or not something is true. but it is of supreme importance that people have faith in its truth. Truth and the faith that something is true. These sets of interests belong to entirely different, almost opposite worlds. End quote. Footnote 271 cites the source. Once again, Nietzsche suggests that religious faith results from the slave's instinct to minimize pain and suffering, not from an honest regard for the truth. Hence, he suggests that, quote, a faithful person is not free to have any sort of conscience for the question of true or untrue. Honesty on this point would be his immediate downfall. People with convictions have pathologically conditioned optics, which make them into fanatics, end quote. Footnote 272 cites the source. For Nietzsche, faith ultimately amounts to a disingenuous sense of certainty, and any justification for it usually just begs the question, as he suggests in one of his characterizations of it. Quote, I have faith that faith makes it blessed. Consequently, it is true. End quote. Footnote 273 cites the source. As is the case with many of the problems he associates with Christianity and the Antichrist, Nietzsche believes that the prevalence of faith is largely related to the priestly caste effort to gain power. He writes, quote, I wage war on this theologian instinct. Anyone with theologian blood in his veins will approach things with a warped and deceitful attitude. This gives rise to a pathos that calls itself faith, turning a blind eye to yourself for once and for all, so you do not have to stomach the sight of an incurable mendacity. End quote. Footnote 274 cites the source. Nietzsche concludes that, quote, if faith is needed above all else, then reason, knowledge, and inquiry have to be discredited. The path to truth becomes the forbidden path. End quote. Footnote 275 cites the source. Along these lines, Nietzsche explicitly juxtaposes religion with science throughout the Antichrist, associating the former with self-deception and the latter with a sincere concern for truth. In section 52, for instance, he suggests that, quote, the church has to condemn all straight, honest, scientific paths to knowledge as forbidden paths. Doubt is already a sin. End quote. Footnote 276 cites the source. Elsewhere, when explaining why he thinks religion constitutes a, quote, crime against a life, end quote, Nietzsche complains that, quote, a religion like Christianity, which is completely out of touch with reality, which immediately falls apart if any concession is made to reality, would of course be morally opposed to the wisdom of this world, which is to say, science. End quote. Footnote 277 cites the source. Once more, Nietzsche argues that the impetus for the animosity between religion and science largely lies in the priestly caste's quest to gain power. He expounds on how science is at odds with their ascent to power as follows. Quote, it is all over for priests and gods when people become scientific. Moral, science is the taboo of all taboos. It is the only thing forbidden. Science is the first sin, the seed of all sins, the original sin. Only this is morality. Thou shalt not know. End quote. Footnote 278 is the source. As a result, he thinks the priestly caste attempts to destroy knowledge and science by endorsing supernatural concepts like judgment, sin, redemption, and forgiveness, suggesting that these concepts, quote, are invented to destroy people's sense of causation, end quote. Footnote 279 cites the source, and that, quote, the priest can only imagine one great danger, and that is science, the healthy concepts of cause and effect, end quote. Footnote 280 cites the source. Accordingly, he locates the origin of sin in the priestly caste's reaction to science, as indicated by the following, quote, science generally only flourishes in favorable conditions. You need a surplus of time and spirit in order to know. Consequently, people need to be made unhappy. You can already guess what would enter the world given this logic. Sin. The concepts of guilt and punishment, the whole moral world order is invented against science, against priests losing their hold on people. End quote. Footnote 281 cites the source. In response to the threat of science, Nietzsche argues that, quote, the priest in itself invents troubles, death, the moral dangers of pregnancy, every type of misery, age, hardship, and above all, illness, end quote. Footnote 282 cites the source. Because, quote, troubles prevent people from thinking. War, among other things, a huge source of disruption for science. End quote. Footnote 283 cites the source. To be sure, Nietzsche believes many of the ills he associates with religion are a result of priestly influence. For instance, when chronicling the history of Christianity, Nietzsche suggests that the concept of God, quote, becomes a tool in the hands of priestly agitators who now interpret all happiness as a reward, all unhappiness as a punishment for disobeying God, for sins, That most deceitful of all modes of interpretation, the supposed moral world order, which turns the natural concepts of cause and effect on their heads once and for all. End quote. Footnote 284 cites the source. This priestly caste needed, quote, an anti-natural causality, end quote, and as a result, quote, all the rest of unnature now follows, end quote. Footnote 285 cites the source. Thus, largely as a result of this priestly influence, Christianity becomes entrenched in rampant falsifications and self-deceptions. In this manner, Scripture is said to stem from the priest's effort to maintain power, as indicated in the following, quote, advancing to the next stage, the will of God, which is to say the conditions for maintaining power in the hands of the priests, needs to be divulged. This calls for a revelation. In simple terms, an enormous literary falsification is needed. A holy scripture is discovered. From now on, everything in life will be arranged so that the priest is everywhere indispensable. The holy parasite will show up at all the natural occasions of life, at birth, marriage, illness, death, not to mention sacrifice, meals, and denature them all, in his words, sanctify them. Viewed psychologically, sins are indispensable in every society organized by priests. They are the real levers of power. The priest lives on sin. He needs sinning to happen. He coldly and cynically measures peoples, ages, and individuals according to whether they promote or oppose the domination of the priests. End quote. Footnote 286 cites the source. Clearly, Nietzsche thinks that the interests of the priestly caste are at odds with an honest pursuit of truth. And he concludes that, quote, as long as the priest is considered a higher type of person, this professional negator, slanderer, poisoner of life, there will not be an answer to the question, what is truth? Truth has already been turned on its head when someone who consciously champions nothingness and negation passes for the representative of truth. End quote. Footnote 287 cites the source. In sum, quote, anything a theologian thinks is true must be false. This is practically a criterion of truth. His most basic instinct of self-preservation does not allow any scrap of reality to be honored or even expressed. End quote. Footnote 288 cites the source. Many of Nietzsche's reflections in the Antichrist pertain to the history of Christianity in particular, and to the problems allegedly plaguing this history, and they may not apply to other religions. Having said that, he writes that, quote, the history of Israel is invaluable because it is typical of all histories where natural values are denatured, end quote. Footnote 289 cites the source, which on his account would include the histories of most other religions. In other words, the history of Christianity illustrates the same kind of self-deception and denaturalization of reality found in many other religions. The first point Nietzsche emphasizes regarding the history of Christianity is that it actually begins with Judaism and a corresponding instinct of resentment. Accordingly, he suggests that Christianity, quote, is not a counter-movement to the Jewish instinct, end quote, but rather, quote, it is its natural consequence, a further conclusion drawn by its terrifying logic, end quote. Footnote 290 cites the source. Nevertheless, the final stage in the history of Christianity actually consists of its rejection of Judaism, which he believes involves significant misunderstandings on the part of most Christians. He explains that, quote, as soon as the gap between Jew and Judeo-Christian appeared, the latter had no choice except to use the same methods of self-preservation dictated by the Jewish instinct against the Jews themselves, while the Jews had only ever used them against non-Jews. The Christian is just a Jew with less rigorous beliefs, end quote. Footnote 291 cites the source. Thus, Nietzsche concludes that, quote, the small rebel movement christianed with the name of Jesus of Nazareth is the Jewish instinct once again, end quote. Footnote 292 cites the source. For Nietzsche, this all goes to show that, quote, the Jews are the most disastrous people in the world history. They have left such a falsified humanity in their wake that even today Christians can think of themselves as anti-Jewish without understanding that they are the ultimate conclusion of Judaism. End quote. Footnote 293 cites the source. Furthermore, Nietzsche asserts that most religious individuals are not themselves aware of any of these self-deceptions, hence the self-deception. For instance, since Christians don't realize that they are actually the inevitable spawn of their Jewish ancestry, he declares that, quote, Christians, the people who have been called Christian for 2,000 years, are just a psychological self-misunderstanding, end quote. Footnote 294 cites the source. Once again, although he highlights Christianity throughout the Antichrist, Nietzsche still applies many of his findings to other religions. For example, he relates St. Paul, footnote 295. Nietzsche thinks that Paul is Nietzsche thinks that Paul is much to blame for many of the misrepresentations of Christ that he enumerates. And he even goes so far as to suggest that Paul was the antithesis of Jesus. One of Nietzsche's chief complaints against Paul is that Paul is one who emphasizes an afterlife, appealing to the prospects of a better life after this natural one on earth, which together with the idea of immortality, he portrays as a reward that must be earned. Nietzsche claims that, thanks in large part to Paul's influence, quote, a number of different things started seeping into the type of the Redeemer, the doctrines of judgment and return, the doctrine of death as a sacrifice, and the doctrine of the resurrection. And at this point, the whole idea of blessedness, the solitary reality of the evangel, vanishes with the wave of the hand, and all for the sake of a state after death. End quote. Excuse me. Ultimately, Nietzsche argues that almost everything about Christ's actual nature was falsified by Paul. Excuse me. And I quote all the stuff that was, or I cite the sources for all the stuff that was quoted in that footnote. Again, that was footnote 295. I'll go back and read that. For example, he relates St. Paul, footnote 295, and Christianity to Muhammad and Islam, suggesting that Muhammad later borrowed, quote, Paul's invention, his method of priestly tyranny, of forming the herds, the belief in immortality, which is to say the doctrine of the judgment, end quote. Footnote 296 cites the source. With respect to the religious, whom he accuses of denaturing reality, he ultimately suggests that, quote, examined more closely and in spite of all belief, they had been governed only by instincts, end quote. Footnote 297 cites the source. Similarly, he claims that while, quote, people have always talked about faith, they have always acted from instinct, end quote. Footnote 298 cites the source. The implication is that despite the pervasive appeals the religious make to supernatural phenomena, or as James would say, to an unseen order, they are all the while still motivated by purely natural forces. Nietzsche's depiction of the relationship between religion and truth is certainly controversial, and there are several issues worth mentioning here. One reasonable objection is that Nietzsche actually says very little that is novel. One could argue, for example, that Nietzsche simply offers a restatement of the secular Enlightenment. For example, the idea that a, quote, priestly caste is responsible for religion as we know it. Similarly, the suggested divide between Christ and Paul used to be made by Christian scholars in the 19th century, and such a divide is thought by many to have been subsequently discredited. Aside from offering little that is new, another problem surfaces with respect to the sheer degree of vitriol present in Nietzsche's analysis. One can't help but sense a high degree of bias underlying it and wonder whether someone like Nietzsche is capable of an objective analysis of the subject matter. Not surprisingly, critics suggest that Nietzsche's portrayal of religion and of those who are religious is unfair and borders on caricature, and they argue that Nietzsche makes extraordinarily sweeping judgments and oversimplifications. As will become clear in Chapter 3, it is not hard to imagine someone like James suggesting that Nietzsche's evidence is not very good and that he seems to be imposing a generally negative attitude towards what is, in actuality, a much more complex and varied reality. What's more, while Nietzsche claims that Christianity is antithetical to any honest pursuit of truth, including the prospects of science, others have suggested that the opposite is actually the case. For instance, there are those who suggest that the Western passion for truth is actually rooted in Christianity, and some, like Alfred North Whitehead, have argued that Christianity played an important role in the rise of modern science. Nevertheless, despite these concerns, Nietzsche clearly thinks that religion is marred by falsifications and self-deceptions. As it turns out, he thinks religion not only fosters self-deception, it is also sickly and life-negating, which renders it nihilistic, and on his account, a kind of psychological disease. I now turn to a more detailed analysis of this equally controversial contention. Again, that was Part 3, Religion and Truth, from Chapter 2, Friedrich Nietzsche and the Antichrist, from The Utility of Religion, Mill, Nietzsche, and James. Thanks.